Good day, everyone. Welcome to our Advent Anticipation Theological Roundtable. I am Gordon Rankin, the Conference Minister serving the New Hampshire Conference of the United Church of Christ. This is the first in a series of 3 Advent Theological Roundtables being produced by the New Hampshire Conference. These roundtables will be sent out via our conference weekly news and via the conference Facebook page, and will be available on our YouTube channel, all in advance of the season of Advent. They are available for our churches and for others to use however you would like throughout the season of Advent. So with an understanding of how these roundtables will be used, I do need to confirm with our panel of theologians this day that they are willing to allow their words and wisdom to be shared among our churches in this way. Do you all agree to this?
Yes.
Thank you. With that, we will actually introduce who this panel of theologians are. And we will begin with Cheryl Stromski, who is one of our members in discernment, who has been approved for ordination pending call and is currently serving extended pulpit supply at the Newfields Community Church.
Hi, it's a great opportunity to be here. Thank you for having me.
Next is the Reverend Mandy Lape-Freeberg, Senior Pastor of the Church of Christ at Dartmouth College, UCC.
Delighted to be here and so pleased to spend some time thinking about Advent with my colleagues.
And then we have the Reverend Holly Tomilson, who is currently valuing some Sabbath time.
Yes, I am. Thank you. And I am excited to talk about anticipation and Advent, my favorite season.
And the final member of our panel today is the Reverend Emilia Halstead, pastor of the First Congregational Church of Concord.
Gordon, it's really great to be here. And yes, I also love Advent, so this is a happy place for me.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here as we set the stage for today's topic, which is Advent anticipation. We are going to turn to a couple scriptures because the good Advent prophecies, you can't stick with one, they're just too good. So we had to do 2 this morning. The first is Jeremiah 33:14-16. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Jacob. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is the name by which it is to be called. The Lord is our righteousness. And then we want to hear these words from the 11th chapter, 1st through 9th verses of the prophet Isaiah. A shoot will come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, with the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. His delight shall be the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loin. The wolf shall lie down with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together. And a little child, shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. So with those scriptures in mind, we are going to start engaging in some conversation. And I'm going to start with this question. So many of our faith traditions are built around the ideas of remembering the stories of faith, do this in remembrance of me, or living out the lessons of faith, go and do likewise. Advent introduces a very different concept to our spiritual practices: anticipation. For you, and perhaps for the communities you serve as well, what is the importance of the spiritual practice of anticipation?
Well, I think I would have answered that question differently pre-COVID. So I think we live in a world, or we lived in a world, where immediacy was the watchword of the day. You know, we can order something from Amazon and it feels like practically before we've pressed the button, even if we feel guilty about dealing with that company, it's on the porch, ready to go. And so much of our lives are fast-paced and gratification is instantaneous. But the pandemic has made us wait, and it has made us defer gatherings and being with people, and long planned for trips were postponed. And there are some new babies in my lives I still haven't held in my life and in my congregation's life. And so I think anticipation has a whole different flavor and tenor post or mid COVID than it does beforehand, because and I think it's one of the gifts of spirituality that can help us during these really frustrating times when we're made to wait and wait and wait. So what are the gifts of waiting? I don't have any answers, but I think that it's potent to be thinking about the season of anticipation in a time when I feel like we're waiting for a lot of things.
So I can appreciate what you're saying, though why I love Advent is the very fact of this time of waiting and preparing. And I get frustrated with the commercial world because Christmas comes before, I mean, nowadays it's before Thanksgiving. And we're so intense about Christmas and all the things about Christmas that we don't take the time to, you know, do the one candle a week and muse on, you know, think about what that candle is about and how can I be in relationship with this baby that's coming into the world. You know, like, I think we forget the beauty of this holiday, the beauty of this time of Advent is to prepare us to be in relationship with Christ. That's how I look at it. And so this Jesus is going to come into the world. Are we going to be ready to do what Jesus calls us to do? Are we ready now today to do what Jesus calls us to do? Oh, no, we're very busy buying presents and decorating our trees and putting up lights and worrying about all the people on our list. And it should not be the most stressful time of year. It should be the most contemplative time of year.
I'd build on both. I agree with both of you. You know, that this time of anticipation and waiting is difficult because we are sort of an instant gratification culture. But I really like, Gordon, the way you phrased it. You know, what is this spiritual practice of anticipation, and how is it different than our other spiritual practices of remembering and of living out? And I like the way you phrase that, because I think it is an inner practice, and it is related to, like, the idea of anticipation, the idea of hoping is related not only to a future, like something that we anticipate and desire, but it's also held in tension with what has been and the promises that have been delivered, right? Hope does not have roots. Hope does not exist on its own. It's rooted in our tradition, and it's part of our going forward. And yet it's within the tension of the both of those. And like Holly was saying, you know, to take the time to be in that moment is challenging and difficult. And we sometimes don't even think about doing it, which is so important that we do.
I absolutely agree. And I think part of the piece of anticipation that has always been important for me in my own spiritual practice is the ability to be in anticipation without having a particular outcome that I'm hoping for at the end.
Mhm.
That it is just a sense of being in anticipation and trusting that something is going to happen. But if I let go of what that is, when it is, how it is, that it creates a space for me to be in the present moment rather than thinking 3 steps ahead, whether it's to Christmas or anything else. The other thing I wanted to share about this, and this year I've been studying Celtic spirituality as a self-driven study. And one of the things I found out recently is that the Celtic Christians actually decided to start Advent on November 15th, so that it's a 40 days similar, because there was a desire to have that much space for waiting in anticipation the way we do in Lent. And as soon as I read that, I was like, these are my people. So so I really started my own reflection on Monday, on the 15th, and it's just given me all of this wonderful space to feel like I can spread out into my anticipation in a way that I haven't necessarily before. So yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that what you said that got me thinking, Emilia, is so that anticipation. I used to I had this boyfriend. We used to put up a little Christmas tree in our apartment, and his mother would send tons of packages and whatnot. And so this tree had little packages under it for weeks before Christmas. And oh gosh, I was like a little child. I'd shake them sometimes, like, what's in here? But inevitably, presents would be opened on Christmas Day, and then I just feel this enormous letdown. And that's sort of how I feel about once I became involved in Christianity and my faith and starting to really pay attention to this. I realized that all this hubbub about Christmas obviously takes away from the message. And for me, like Christmas Eve, I love the contemplative services because they're not filled with all the tinsel and the excitement and the songs and it's like the present has come, the light is here, and I don't feel let down. I feel like this is gonna be great. I'm kind of being a little facetious, but just that it's happening again. Like here we are, we're back to this place and we're beginning again.
I love that, Holly. No, my my mother-in-law used to say, she grew up in the era of radio. And she said when they would sit around and listen to the radio shows and something scary was mentioned, she said it was so much scarier than anything that she ever saw in a movie when she grew older. And because it was what was scary to her.
Mm-hmm.
It left room for her participation, her personality, her visions. And just when you were talking about that, shaking the gifts and wondering and then opening them and feeling empty, the power of anticipation in part is that we get to fill in what we're waiting for. We get to fill in what we're most hoping for. We get to imagine the world inspired by, these traditions of that the days are surely coming when I will fulfill the promise made to the house of Israel. But what does that promise look like to me, which is maybe different than to you and different to you and different to you. And so I think that you're right, that anticipation can be laden with some soul searching about what we're willing to work for and what we want to see happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, also thinking about what Sherry said about hope. If we just go into this time without bringing the hope of the hope of what can be and the remembrance of what has happened that God has brought forth, then that too, in that moment of self-reflection, we're losing. I agree with Sherry in that we do need to sort of come into I know hope is one of the candles, but really the whole month is hope. right? What is going to happen to me when I allow this, this Jesus into my life, this light that's coming into the world? And how is that helping me through this darker time that isn't a time of sorrow? Like Lent can be so heavy, but Advent is this time of, look, like you said, self-reflection. Am I ready? Am I ready for this to happen? Am I prepared? And we do the candles to help us build up those qualities to be ready for the light of Christ, that night when we light that bright candle.
I know for me, the seasons of Advent and Lent are just really spiritually important. And coming off of what you've all said, I think it's because they offer that pause and pay attention reminder. And the reality is, in my life, I need that pause and pay attention reminder as part of my spiritual practice.
Right.
Well, and I was thinking of the role that hope plays, Holly, you just mentioned. And I had written down beside that first question, we are always waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises. Like, come on, God, we're ready for justice in the streets. We're ready for safety in Jerusalem. We're ready for that. So that sense of kind of that our lives are lived in expectantly waiting for the promises to be fulfilled. And that's where the hope comes in.
That seems like a good lead into our next question. So part of the reason we read prophecies such as Jeremiah during the season of Advent is they are a foreshadowing of the birth of Jesus. In what ways were God's promises fulfilled in the Messianic arrival? And are there still promises of God that we're still awaiting, still anticipating the fulfillment of? As we anticipate Cheryl returning to us as we continue this conversation.
Yeah, what happened? I was challenged by this question, and I feel that I have this, there's this, people often don't blame God for like why there's violence in the world, or why are people starving? Why isn't God helping? And so what was challenging for me is that I believe that we are the vessels of God. Like the laws, the covenants, they're all ways of teaching us how to be in community and how to care for each other, and especially to care for those that don't have enough. And so I feel like God's promises are there. They're in us. That the promises will be realized when we realize that we are the keepers of the promise and we're the ones that need to make the promise happen. I guess I just don't have this theology that God is going to swoop in and fix the world, because we're taught that we're the ones that are going to fix the world.
Yeah, I find this a complicated passage, and because so when I looked at it, I do this weird color coding when I read scripture, because it just helps me to see patterns. And it's all the action verbs are God's, I will fulfill, I promised, I will make happen, I will cause. It's really interesting. And I read a little reflection about this passage, and it said, this is not a hortatory passage where we're inspiring the congregation to get up and do stuff. This is a passage where we are assured of God's intention to bring God's promises to fruition. That said, I completely agree with you, Holly. I think that often the things we want to blame God for are the things that we should have done something about and haven't. But it's an interesting passage that all the action verbs are God's verbs. I think part of what happened in the coming of the Messiah was this connection between humanity that Christ made more evident, the kind of breaking down of stigma and the trying to open up of repressive patterns and the calling the religious life to account, to not become part of what keeps people stuck. But the whole justice part, the whole poor being raised up and the wicked sent away empty, which some days I kind of go, please, some days I think, no, I don't want anybody to be punished. I want us all to change. But I feel like I'm really still waiting on the systemic, cultural, world justice part.
I completely agree. I think for me, it really, I guess in my theology, realizing as I hear you all reflect, is that space of dropping a pebble in a pond, that God created the initiation. And from there has been ripples of creativity and the opposite from humanity, and that's how we function as creations and working towards that long arc towards justice. One of the other things that I've learned about this year that I didn't know is just how far Christianity was into the East and into China in particular, round about the 600s. And there's an incredible image of a cross rising up out of a lotus flower, which just so blew my mind in that space of the reason the lotus is so revered is because it grows up out of the muck and the mire of what's underneath it, and to create this beautiful space. And all of a sudden I had a new space for my understanding of the Messiah, drawing on other people's, century-old revelations of what it meant to them. And so knowing that I sit in this space of participating with my creativity, knowing that God is going to do things with everybody's creativity to work towards this space of the fulfillment of the promise.
Well, also, I'm sorry, did I interrupt someone? If you look at it as I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel, and I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David. Obviously, we use that as look, and then came Jesus, the Messiah. And I think that because I know the Jewish people feel that Jesus wasn't the Messiah because he didn't save them from this empire. But what I feel is Jesus saved us from the empire in the sense that Jesus taught us how to live in this faith without becoming part of the empire. And you can hear that in his little asides to, the religious leaders, like, I'm talking to my disciples, but I'm really telling you guys. So in that sense, I would say, so to me, I feel in some ways that in the Christian faith, we have experienced the realization of God's promises because God brought us an example of righteousness, of justice and righteousness. And God showed us through God how to live out, how to experience these promises, how to live them out, and how to take them in.
Are we on question 2?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my internet went out. Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on that. Focus here for a minute. So the how were God's promises fulfilled, and how are we looking for them to be fulfilled in the future, right? So in reading the passage in Jeremiah, prior to that, we discover that like Nebuchadnezzar is fast invading Israel, and the people are devastated. They're probably going to die. Last night, I watched the nuclear film put on by the conference, War Game. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But it was it was sobering and horrifying. And to think that we are on the brink of possible destruction like that. And there's so many things in our world that are suffering related, right? The violence and the hate mongering and the divisions, and Jerusalem was no different. They were suffering, and God said, and the prophet Jeremiah was like, I've told you, I've told you, I've told you, I've told you, I've told you. And they incarcerated him, they put him in prison. And then now from prison, he brings this promise. He says, God will live into God's promises. God will heal you. God will restore you. God will bring back the prosperity of your nation. And I think that's really a message for today, right? Where is our hope? What are we anticipating, and how are we going to get there? I don't think hope is, or anticipation is, sorry, there's talking in the background, it's distracting. It's not latent. It requires action, right? The skies aren't going to open up and God's going to deliver peace. That's something we have to work toward. We have to anticipate that by working with God. And I think that's what happened in the Jeremiah passage, where God said, I will restore you. And this was the hope. And that came through Jesus. Is like Holly said, Jesus is teaching us to love a different way, to wait upon God and to find that inner stillness and to make different choices. One of the last things in closing in that movie was when the bomb was dropped on Great Britain, the response was, well, if they drop a bomb, should we retaliate? And everybody said yes. But I think that's the way not. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
You all have raised a new question for me, which crosses over into the conversation in our third roundtable around incarnation. So this may not be a question fair for you. It may be one that I have to save for that moment if I can remember until we record that conversation. But I find myself wondering now how much of incarnation is an outcome of the agency of God, and what responsibility do we have for incarnation? So I will at least put that out there for everybody else to think and ponder about and come up with their answers.
I'm trying to write the question down.
I think this is a very oblique answer to your question, but I think one of the interesting things is that Jeremiah is first person narrative. I will, as though the Lord is speaking. But in Isaiah, it's not really prophecy. It's not really poetry. It doesn't have and the word of the Lord came to. It's it's kind of this interesting standalone in the midst of the socioeconomic political world, and then in the kind of bearing out in the natural world. And it's almost incarnation in the world as we find it. And Jeremiah is incarnation in the Spirit of the Lord. And so it's not really an answer, but it is an observation that these two texts are coming from different viewpoints that strengthen the fact that that's how God works in the world. God is both present and inspiring us.
Well, why don't we jump to talking about the Isaiah passage for a moment? Clearly, one of the most beautiful of the Advent prophecies is Isaiah's vision of the peaceable kingdom. So often in the past, as I have thought about this passage, I've usually thought about it in the context of peace between nations. This year, I find I'm hearing these words differently. Even within our own communities, we find aggression and, yes, at times violence seems to be an expected tool for getting what one wants. How does one preach the peaceable kingdom in 2021? Do we still believe that God will lead us, or that we will follow God's lead to a time when we will neither hurt or destroy what God deems to be sacred? And yes, I'm aware I've switched the numbers of the questions. We'll come back to the other one.
So I'll jump in and say that this year, this resonates deeply for me this year in that I found out finally that I am an Enneagram 9 for those who do the Enneagram, which basically means I'm Pooh Bear and I live in the 100-acre wood, and that's my happy place. And that part of my role as an Enneagram 9 is to invite people to come hang out in the 100-acre woods with me. And there's a space of the peaceable kingdom for which that deeply resonates as well. That for me, there's a space in which it already is here, right? Like, we still have, a circle of life and animals eating animals, and that's how it's functioning. But really living into that space, even as Jesus talks about it, it's here. The kingdom is literally here. You have to be willing to open the door to find it and see it and create space for the rest of then the domino effect to function. So I think God has been leading us to this forever. And as you shifted the question, yes, it's whether or not we're going to be willing to follow to that. And going back to that space of anticipation for myself, I anticipate that it will eventually happen. Will I live to see it? Meh. But really, truly trusting that it is possible, and rather than getting hung up on whether or not it will happen, and really living into the space for me, the faith that I have that it is possible.
Oh, Amelia, I could use a double portion of your spirit right now. That really famous painting, The Peaceable Kingdom, where the animals are all, apparently, I didn't know this until I read a little thing about it. Off to the side, apparently, is William Penn making a treaty with indigenous people. Yeah. Not feeling really good about that peaceable kingdom, especially on the eve of Thanksgiving, as we think about what it means to live in Abenaki and other land that we weren't ever really given, that we took. And so I just feel so discouraged at humanity's pervasive, chronic missing the mark. God lays out, this is how we could be. The predator and the prey could live together in its most vulnerable moment and not hurt each other. No one will be hurt on my holy mountain. And we're like, yeah, we got a better idea for what to do here. I want more. And so I want to believe, and I think if Jeremiah could say these words in the middle of exile, I certainly can say them in the middle of abundance. But I struggle with this, how long, oh Lord, how long, oh Lord?
Well, I'm sorry.
No. How long will we keep missing the point? Excuse me, Holly, please.
No, I interrupted you. I just looked up the painting and it's ironic.
Yeah.
I feel what you're saying, Mandy, because I have the other part of the pandemic is allowing, at least for me, time to really focus on what is happening. And I love, Amelia, the imagery of the 100-acre wood. I think we talked about this not too long ago, and to be able to live in the 100-acre wood is that my place of rest. Like when I read those books as an adult, to be able to live in that place. But like Mandy, or maybe I'm reading into what you're saying, Mandy, but I have sort of lost hope, and I'm not a person who loses hope, because through my faith, I've always had hope, but I've sort of lost hope in this country more than anything in the last year and a half. And I read that the vaccine mandate, it was voted to not allow a vaccine mandate. I just glanced at the headline before I put the paper away, and I'm so disheartened what happened? You'd think that in 2021, we'd be that much more enlightened as human beings, that we would be that much kinder to us. And the fact that we know the whole globe, we know the whole world now. We know about all these people all over the world. And yet we are so incredibly selfish with each other in this country. And not, obviously that's a general statement. And I grew up in the 60s. I had college students in and out of the house I grew up in. My parents taught us about the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the environmental movement, all that stuff, and the anti-war movement. And I grew up believing that these things were going to come to fruition and we would be living in what would be the peaceable kingdom. And when I sort of woke up in my 20s and saw that not much had changed, some had changed, there had been change, and change is really slow. And so that is where I go with this peaceable kingdom, is that what may not seem like enough change in 20 years to me is the beginning of change. And what feels like a backward slide today, there are so many other people that are working towards continuous change. And to make this place, this country, that peaceable kingdom, this beautiful stew of people. And unfortunately, what sells news is the anger and the violence and the cruelty that we're experiencing in our world. But we don't hear about the love and the kindness that people share with each other on a regular basis. But this was a hard question, Gordon, to be quite honest, because I'm not good at preaching the peaceful kingdom, because I tend to preach what we need to do in order to create the peaceful kingdom. And I don't always leave people with hope. I leave them with regrets that they have not worked hard enough.
Well, and that's why I love that these two passages are together, that Jeremiah, which is in the first person coming from the Spirit of God, and that Isaiah, which is promises that are less first person, are held in tension, so that it is God's work in our midst, and we need to get on board. But what's there, all the kind of adages that are both helpful because they're succinct and annoying because they're succinct. But believe as if it all depends on God, but act as if work as if it all depends on you. This kind of sense in which we're in the both end place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I kind of like the way that the Isaiah passage reorders priorities, I think Amanda was saying, where the ones that have been devoured are now safe. And I hear that in terms of our own issues with social justice. How do we make those changes, and how do we find hope? And how do we find hope? Like I think it was Holly was saying, when we're the top feeders, and when you're the bottom feeder, how do you find that hope? And I think that's what that anticipation holds for us. And I'm hearing is that, how do we anticipate those moments when change will come, and how do we, as the church, live into that anticipation between what will be and what is and what has been.
Yeah, I mean, I think about things like the LGBTQIA movement and the way the world was in 1950 and the way the world is now.
Right.
You couldn't have imagined. And so there has been, and we are, at least we talk about the fact that we tend to kill Black men with a fair amount of regularity in this nation, even among our law enforcement people, who are the very people who are supposed to be protecting. We're talking about it. So I remember after a recent election, I drew an arc, and I wrote, the Theodore Parker phrase that MLK made so famous: the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I drew a little thing. I said, I thought we were here, like on the downward part of the arc, but I think we're here. We're still going up, getting away from justice before we. So it is the long haul. And I appreciate so much what you said, Emilia, but it may not happen in my lifetime. Again, it makes me think of MLK, we may not get there, but we're going to get there.
Well, also, thinking about the arc, part of what I feel is happening now is there are people that have had a lot of power that are losing, quote unquote, in their minds, they're losing their power instead of understanding that we can all have power. And so it's like little crying babies, except they're grown people that are violent.
Highly weaponized and monetarily and power and
and actual weapons.
yeah.
But you're both, all of you guys are reminding me again of that little by little, step by step. Those of us who take seriously being people of God are working towards all of this. And yes, we will not see it in our lifetime, but in our lifetime, many of us have seen, like you said, I mean, the LGBTQIA movement, there are books out by people who are transgender, who have publicly acknowledged that they are transgender. That I never expected to see in my lifetime. And what a joy to be able to encounter people who are their authentic selves. That's part of the peaceful kingdom. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I will readily admit the question is a difficult one. I think it's a question that the scriptures raise to us all that's difficult. Although I will say I have now found my more fun way of reframing the question that I will take with me to ponder this Advent, which is, how do we preach Pooh Bear in an Eeyore world? So.
Oh, I love it.
Yes.
So I just,
Some of us are piglets. That's how we survive in this.
Fair enough.
so I just got this book today in the mail, The Preacher's Bible Handbook by O.
Huh.
Wesley Allen Jr. And it's just a little kind of paragraph or two summation about each different portion of each book in scripture. And whenever I, decide to buy a new book, I try it out by a test case. So I looked up this little piece about the Jeremiah passage, just like 3 minutes before we went on. And I love this line. And I think this I way prefer How Do We Live as Pooh Bear in Eeyore World, but said, the ultimate challenge may be, how does the preacher find words for God who, and let me just say, you remember Jeremiah, a lot of his book is saying, you've blown it, you've missed the mark, you're terrible, you're in exile, you're being punished because you forgot to be the people you're supposed to be. And then there's these chapters of promise at the end. So how does the preacher find words for a God who has high, radical, covenantal expectation for God's people, but whose expectations are nested in grace? Isn't that a beautiful, nested in grace?
Yeah.
What a phrase.
Hmm.
And maybe that's what Advent is. It's a time when we're nested in grace.
Like that. That's a
Well,
good
I'm going to say that's
screenshot.
kind of an interesting lead into our final question together, which is a little bit of the Pooh Bear in an Eeyore world question too. There's no question that the prophecies of hopeful anticipation struck a bit of a dissonant chord in the community of the day, which was a little more in the challenges and troubles and being aware of all of that. So I wanted to ask us, and I kind of like the fact we're concluding with this question, what are the things of God that we do still hopefully anticipate in 2021? And who are the prophets of this day, and are we able to hear them?
So I grew up, there's a reason for this, the short story. I grew up with Godspell and didn't know there was a whole nother song called The Beautiful City. No clue, because we didn't watch the movie. We had and that song has now become a Christmas song for me, an Advent song. For those of you who are watching who don't know it, Beautiful City, from Godspell. And there's a line in the second verse that says, we may not reach the ending, but we can start. We can slowly start to mend brick by brick and heart by heart. And I think for me in 2021, the thing that I keep coming back to is I can always take another step. It might take me 20 years to get the step beyond that, but I can always take another step. And also finding the ways in which being in a faith community give me the space to, if I feel like I am stuck, can call out for help and say, all right, y'all, these seems to have turned into cement. Could you do me a favor and help me crack out of this? And I think it is the prophets of the day of today that help to create that space of when we get stuck in the mud, being able to say, all you need to do is just one more step, and we can help you do that if you need help. Yeah.
Beautiful. So I think about concrete stuff. I think about children getting vaccinated. I think about being able to gather with less concern. Those are some of the things, because there's not much 2021 left. So I'm hoping for little things to give me hope. And then I just want to name a couple of the prophets of the day for me, partly before you all name them. So the people that I listen to as often as I can is William Barber, the Bishop William Barber, the Poor People's Campaign. And Bill McKibben, I think, is a prophet. He works with 350.org, and he's talking about how we've got to save this planet. We have to steward it well, and we have to make it last. And then Mary Ludy is a prophet for me. I just, every time she writes a devotion, I see her name and I'm like, oh, yay! Because she always twists something for me. She always says it real, but she also always gives me some hope.
Yeah.
If I can interrupt for just a moment, I figure I should share that Bill McKibben will be speaking at North Church in Portsmouth in February or March as part of their 350th anniversary celebration. So if we're going to raise him as a prophet, I figured I should let people know that they can have an opportunity to hear him.
I was doing some work on, what is a prophet? I mean, I looked at this question and I thought, well, there's the typical people that come to mind, Martin Luther King Jr. and Dorothy Day and, Mother Teresa. And I thought, but who are the prophets for today? And I thought about some of the people that I like to read, like I like Walter Brueggemann and some of the preachers I like, but I'm thinking, a prophet speaks to all of the people and gives them a vision that they can all hold. And as we've been talking, there are these differences, right? There are the haves and the have-nots, and there's these divisions between political parties and between different ideologies. And a prophet speaks to all of them with a sort of a shared value. And so I looked at some people like Abdul Razak Gurnah, who received the Nobel Peace Prize for his portrayal of colonialism. Speaking out against colonialism. And then there was a Russian author, Dmitry Muratov, and he wrote, even in the face of persecution, about the importance of freedom of speech and the ability for everyone's voice to be heard. And I thought that even though they might not have fallen within the faith tradition, these are values that speak to all people.
I struggled with this question. I struggled with every one of these questions, Gordon. They're so good. I'm going to say something that may be ridiculous, but I was very touched and moved by President Barack Obama and things he continues to say. I felt like he was a balm, BALM, for this country. And it was the first time in my life I had a president who I felt could relate to me if they ever met me, and I could relate to them because he's also a year younger than me. So that was a first too. But mostly I feel like he is a person that acts in love. and does as best he can. And I know he got criticized for a lot of things, but running an entire government is a lot harder than any of us can ever imagine. But I see him as, and maybe I'm misusing the word prophet because he's not, I think he does give us caution for our actions. And I think he does show us love for humanity.
I have a parishioner. She's amazing. She's a cardiovascular surgeon, and she has 2 young kids, and she and her wife are always willing to help at the church. And she's always reading these theological tomes and asking me questions. And so I asked her to serve on something recently, and she wrote back and said, sure. And my friend and I were having this kind of intellectual, theological, fun conversation. I wonder how you would answer this. She said, we're going to paint a scenario that may or may not be accurate, but imagine that you get to the gate and St. Paul is there, and he's going to ask you whether you should go through the pearly gates into heaven or go down below. She said, again, do we don't have to worry about whether this is actual or not? It's just imagine. And then for some reason, St. Paul gets called away and you get asked to stand at the gate. What are you going to ask people to determine whether they are people of faith or not, whether they are Christians or not, whether they belong? And I don't have an answer for her, but I think it's a really fascinating question. And I think that whole idea of who is a prophet is that same kind of what does it mean to be the light bearers in this world? What does it mean to carry the Spirit of God's desire for abundance for all humanity?
Wow.
So just to bring us full circle in our talk about anticipation, kind of a final quick hit question. What gifts do you find in the spiritual practice of anticipation?
I think the gift I find is the difference between hope and hopes. There's things I want, there's things I hope for personally. And those aren't always the things that dovetail with what God desires. And so in that spiritual practice of anticipation, of waiting, of finding that stillness, sometimes what I hope falls away and what is left is God's hope.
Oh, I like that.
I would say that mine are grounding, feeling grounded, which may seem a little oxymoronic, but and also presence, the present of presence, being in the present moment. Yeah, just creating that space for just waiting and watching to see what happens.
I think the fact that scripture is so full of promise and unrealized promise means that the ache inside of me, the longing for the world to be different than it is not a surprise to God. And that I still belong to this tradition in my achiness. And so I think that's one of the gifts of anticipation for me.
I just think for me, I do struggle with this time of year because it's very dark, and I find that it helps me with that darkness. I'm not as anxious by it let me just preface that with when I actually am intentional in the Advent spirit, right? Certainly leading a church is a challenge because there's so much activity happening that you sometimes lose sight of all of that. But I will say that for me, the waiting and the preparing takes that darkness and it turns it into that sort of velvety warmth that we get in the darkness in summer. It takes away that sort of cold hardness of it. And that's the gift I get from really being intentional in this time period.
How about
We
you?
will-
Oh,
Yeah. How
excuse-
about you? How about you, Gordon?
I think I said mine earlier, which is I appreciate the spiritual reminder to stop and pay attention. And because I do. I mean, it's an invitation that I can accept and be responsive to, and I need that in my spiritual life. Because sometimes it's too easy to say there's too many invitations to pay attention to them all. And but this is one of God's invitations that I definitely stop and pay attention to.
I like
Can I add
that.
one? Can I add one more small thing?
You can.
When I think of anticipation, I think of dancing, and being, well, sorry, Gordon, at least 4 females on this website. When you're slow dancing, and I was always taught to follow, and so you anticipate the move of your partner, and I feel like anticipation is like dancing with God, where you are an active player, and yet you're not the leader. You have to give up control, and you have to anticipate, and it's in that anticipation, it's that place in between, and it's sort of a magical moment, right, between what's going to happen next and what has already been planned. And I think that's the place of Advent, is that magical moment of anticipation in between what's going to be next and what is now.
Okay, I'm sorry, you've just blown up another half hour worth of discussion, but one of my favorite passages is when God tucks Moses in the rock and says that God will let God's glory pass before Moses. And, but no one can see my face and live. And Quinn Callowell did a really fabulous Still Speaking devotional a number of years ago. And he said, we can't see God's face and live because God's walking ahead and we're following. And there's this sense about that's the relationship. That's the sense that we are privileged to follow. And part of when Gordon says it's an invitation that I take God up on, and there's lots that I don't, boy, do I identify with that. And when I'm often in Advent calling us to slow down, I know I'm preaching to myself so strongly.
Yeah.
But when I think about that, no one sees my face and live in light of Advent, we do see the face of God in Advent. And what does that mean? What happens in that kind of nest of grace, as it were, where we are shown the partnership of following as well as the leading that will happen. I mean, gosh, what a potent image. Thank you so much, Cheryl. That's really great.
As we draw our conversation to a close, I think we will wish to everyone that they may find themselves to rest in that nest of grace during this Advent season. We want to thank all of our viewers for joining us for this Advent Anticipation Roundtable. I want to be sure to thank Holly and Cheryl and Mandy and Emilia for all your insights and inspiration that you have shared with us this day, and invite everyone to please check out our other Advent Roundtables and have a blessed Advent season.
Thanks, everyone.